Hey, I think we're live. It's good. So, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. This is not going to be a full expose on Jay Dyer. There's obviously probably books that can be written on the subject because we're not Jay Dyer. The general consensus of the information that I have um, leads to a problem that's much larger than Jay Dyer, and it incorporates what we can call the Back to the Middle Ages movement, which is generally run by the aristocracy, um, the descendants of the Malaspina family, papicidal and killed a pope early in their family line, and yet they're still promoted by things like tradition, family, and property, which is a literally Gnostic sect within the Catholic Church that controls a lot of the opinions of so-called traditionalist Catholics. And if you don't believe that, you can listen to or read. He's a 30-year member of Tradition, Family, and Property who founded the Montfort Association. He wrote a book called The Burlesque, and it's only in Spanish, so you'll have to be able to translate it or Google Translate it or whatever. But it's called The Burlesque Gnosis of Olivia Plinio de Olivier, and it's quite revealing. It's quotes from his published works, pretty much, and also some background information there. And I will be doing an expose on that later on. Now, this debunking of Jay Dyer isn't actually a debunking of Jay Dyer. Jay's arguments against natural theology and some aspect of rationalism within the Catholic Church never held any water for me. I don't think they're convincing. His argument pretty much comes down to you're wrong and you have to repent, and that's that's not an argument. And that generally comes out as the Orthodox argument and the arguments of Gregory Palamas. What we're dealing with instead is the Russian messianic complex, which I believe is going to be um, taken advantage of and has been taken advantage of in the past by the Anglo-Israeli establishment, which is generally run in conjunction with the Guelph oligarchy. So we're talking uh, the Habsburgs, the Saxe-Coburg and Gotha family, which runs Belgium and United Kingdom, the UK Commonwealth, which owns 1/6 of the property in the world, or land in the world. Um, but generally, I see the emergence of a global system where these fiefdoms are intact underneath certain Guelph rulers in conjunction with the Russians. Vladivostok to Dublin program. If Putin doesn't kick out this new Rasputin in called Alexander Dugin, um, yeah, I'm kind of tired right now, and I also had everything prepared for this when I was going to initially do this, which I think was couple days before Christmas, and I lost all my tabs and all my highlighted sections of various works. So it's going to be kind of patchwork today, but I figure we can just make this into a longer expository type thing. Once again, this isn't necessarily an attack on hesychasm and the writings of Palamas per se, but it's about the development and the Baudrillian restoration and reterritorialization of hesychasm into what is called territorial or political hesychasm, just something that emerged around the sociology circles in Russia when Russia was dominated by Russian Martinism, which was brought by people like Joseph de Maistre. I don't know if Joseph de Maistre personally brought it, but remember that de Maistre is this human sacrifice obsessed, ultramontane, uh, traditionalist Freemason, monarchist Freemason, and the traditionalists say, "Oh, no, that doesn't exist. No, 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 please." I just had some guy give me that kind of shit. Um, some big guy that runs around, not big guy, he's a little guy that I guess does interviews with E. Michael Jones and things like that. But they say, "Oh yeah, that doesn't exist," even though de Maistre was a condemned, a formal heretic, and denied the ability of reason in the realms of theology and morality and metaphysics. Um, and this is something that kind of is typical of everything that's a derivative of Martinism and these surrounding movements. Martinism was kind of a uh, umbrella for things like the Scottish Rite in France and several other groups that joined it. So when I say Martinism, we're talking about a large group of uh, Christian syncretic organizations that sometimes they're liberal, sometimes they're not, but they have one thing in common, and that's that they're all kind of Gnostic. They're obsessed with replacing philosophy, the rightful place of philosophy, with spirituality, and which kind of doesn't make sense for Gnosticism. But we're going to get in deeper to how this affects Russia. So there's the political philosopher, favorite of Mark Ackerd and his friends over there at Soul of the East, which is the website that Jay Dyer now owns. And Mark Ackerd was one of the biggest influences on Dyer. Um, Berdayev was part of these circles, and he blamed all the troubles in Russia on Illuminism and said that Catherine mistook Illuminism for Martinism. And so she wrongly targeted Martinists. And Berdayev goes on to defend. It's one of his works. I don't remember. He goes on to defend how many of the Masons in Russia were these monarchists, just like the Maistre. Um, but this is kind of the general ethos, I think, of the Sophiology circles. We discussed this, I believe, in the last video. Sophiology circle in 1905, salon that included, I think, Dayev and people like Bloch and proximate to Florensky and all these individuals. These were the Slavophiles that created, alongside Dostoevsky, what's called the Russian idea, which is the Russian messianic principle based on kind of this cult of the peasantry, of serfdom, and it's actually critical to Russian Bolshevism. And so I think I have an EIR article that we're going to look into concerning this. Um, like I said, this is going to be expository, so we might hear the same kinds of things again and again, but all the better. It's additional evidence. And EIR has been getting a lot more reliable in my. I used to trust about 80% of what would be in a particular article, but now I'm starting to trust it more because everything that I looked into on their works on tradition, family, property, about I couldn't believe it because this is something that runs America Needs Fatima and all sorts of seemingly innocuous groups inside the United States. In Venezuela, they were kicked out for after months investigation for attempts, or rather a preparing to assassinate the Pope, as well as possible uh, fascist narco terrorism, which they're and this is actually news out of Venezuela and congressional hearings, I believe, on the issue in Venezuela, um, as well as stockpiling weapons and all sorts of other things. So um, The things that they and the gnosis aspect checked out once I looked into that expose written by the 30-year-old member called the Burlesque Gnosis of Plinio de Olivier. So, you know, it becomes more and more reliable. And I know, in fact, that EIR was read personally by William Casey on some issues like the Olaf Palm assassination. The CIA was actually briefed by EIR because they had this wide ranging intelligence network, and it was largely targeted at terrorism on both the right wing and the left wing. Um, so it's somewhat of a credible source. Like they have real facts. Sometimes they skew things, but they do have real facts, and they did have the capacity to process all this information and check sources and all that. So here is an EIR article. Should I start with the EIR articles? Because I have a quick debunking, and then we'll go back to this of Jay Dyer. Is Jay was saying, "Oh, this guy is trying to connect uh, Father Seraphim Rose, the guy that basically taught me everything I know about Orthodoxy, in his book Nihilism. Uh, Father Seraphim Rose, they're trying to connect to some Rosicrucian movement," and it's like, yes, it's a fact. Um, and I wrote it in the description of the initial thumbnail I had out for the movie. So, so I got to go find that now. But essentially, Father Seraphim Rose and his closest associate, um, Abbot Herman, well, he became an Abbot. It's Herman Podmonshensky or something like this. Isn't great when the internet doesn't work exactly when you need it. Was heavily involved in something called the Holy Order of Mans. He actually was the key figure to getting it accepted into the Greek Orthodox Church. And I know Jay Dyer doesn't like the Greek Orthodox Church. I know Rocor doesn't like the Greek Orthodox Church, but Jay just flat out denied. Oh yeah, well, Seraphim Rose had nothing to do with this. Now, keep in mind that Seraphim Rose um, has ties to Russian Martinism through all the people that taught him. Um, Simultaneously, one of the biggest influencers of Russian Martinism and the Russian idea, Slavophiles of the 19th century, 20th century. Um, you have Rene Gonan, I believe, inspires Georges Gurdjieff, and Gurdjieff's the guy that ran around with Gurdjieff and promoted him. Peter Ouspensky goes to Britain, and out of that, he inspires Alan Watts. And Alan Watts comes over and is the teacher of Father Seraphim Rose, and initiating him into a spiritual journey. And Father Seraphim Rose still writes well of Alan Watts and Rene Guénon as his initial spiritual teachers. Um, Now, keep that in mind when I read about the Holy Order of Mans and its relation to Father Seraphim Rose's um, Alaskan Brotherhood. I think it's called St. Herman Alaskan Brotherhood. And this is from potgrove.org, which is a resource for survivors of abuse in the Orthodox churches. Yeah, I'm sure somebody will come out and say, "Oh, well, this is funded by the CIA. How dare you?" Um, but yeah, this is the story is around in different places. It's a true story. Holy Order of Mans, MANS. The Holy Order of Mans, HOOM, was its short, HOOM, was a Gnostic New Age cult that was begun by Father Paul Blyton, Earl Wilbur Blyton, in 1968. MANS was an esoteric acronym. According to informed sources, Masters illuminated Knights of the Spirit. So that's what the MANS is supposed to stand for. Was one explanation for the initials. Illuminated is probably a reference to the Order's rite of illumination, where Philip Charles Lucas reported some initiates saw a luminous column inside themselves. What does that sound like? Hesychasm? After Blyton's death in 1974, Vincent Rossi, also known as Master Andrew Rossi and later Father Andrew Rossi, took over leadership of the group. Following the Jonestown massacre in 1978, the order found itself on various cult watch lists. This spurred the new HOOM leader to develop a more traditional Christian appearance for the group. In fact, Rossi even developed a new exoteric explanation for the MANS acronym. He said that the initials stood for the Greek words Mysterion, Agape, Nous, and Sophia. Now, Nous is something that is very particular to Orthodoxy, and Sophia is something that's very particular to the Slavophile Sophiology circles, which believe that there's a fourth person Trinity called the Divine Sophia, and which within Catholic circles, unfortunately, I think John Paul II had one of the books inspired by Florensky. Um, Let me get me old notes out of here. Is it Vel- Thorsten Velbstein? Here we go. Valentin Tomberg. That's him. Had a book on sophiology that he was another German Rosicrucian, I believe, and Martinist. Um, that Pope John Paul II had this book by him on his bedside table, and Benedict XVI actually translated this work into Russian. Um, and sophiology is very important to the whole Marxist, not Marxist, what the hell am I saying? The Bolshevik ideology, or these ideas, or the pre-Bolshevik revolution. I'm really scatterbrained today, especially since I did all this work and then I lost the way I had it all organized. But it's critical to these circles that came out of Russian Martinism. Um, in So we're going back to Blyton and the Holy Order of Mans. In his search for a new direction for whom, Rossi came across the writings of Father Seraphim Rose of St. Herman of Alaskan Brotherhood, which had originated in the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, Rokor. Rossi ultimately decided that Orthodoxy met the order's needs. Father Seraphim died in 1982. The surviving co-founder of the Brotherhood, Abbot Herman Podmonshensky, was suspended from the priesthood in 1984 in the wake of serious moral charges. Now, a lot of these moral charges have to do with abuse of young boys. So anytime you hear about Jay Dyer saying, "Oh, the Catholic Church, these priests can't marry, that's why they abuse young boys," it has nothing to do with that. Um, After the abbot refused to abide by suspend, and I say it's not just this Podmoshensky guy. If you look through parkgrove.org and the other Orthodox abuse sites, it's pretty much just as common in Orthodoxy as it is in in Catholicism, especially in monastic orders. After the abbot refused to abide by suspension, he was removed from the priesthood by Rokor in 1988. The vast majority of the brotherhood remained in Rokor. Abbot Herman was accepted under the homophorium of Bishop Benedict Green. The bishop was the founder of Nous Monastery in Blanco, Texas, more commonly known as Christ of the Hills. Bishop Benedict's diocese was part of the Archdiocese of Vasiliopolis, which was led by the Metropolitan Pangratios Veronis. The Metropolitan had been a priest in the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America, but he was defrocked by that group. With the support of Bishop Benedict, Father Herman met with the Metropolitan to discuss the Holy Order of Man's acceptance into Vasiliopolis. Ultimately, an agreement was reached. The Metropolitan would become the order's bishop, but Rossi would remain the leader of the Holy Order of Man and retain control over the order's assets. Abbot Herman and Bishop Benedict then began to train candidates for ordination. Although Rossi was warned that Vasiliopolis was not recognized by the vast majority of Orthodox and Orthodox and began using the name Christ the Savior Brotherhood. Father Abbot Herman was the guy that operated for a long time for Seraphim Rose's bookstore with him. And this is how Seraphim Rose got into his high position within the Orthodox Church. I think Maximilian Maximilian the Wonder Worker, who was an Orthodox patriarch. See, none of this stuff's fresh. I wish I could have done it before Christmas. Installed Father Seraphim Rose to work in this bookstore. Father Rose brought in Father Abbot Herman. Oh boy. Here we go. Maximilian. St. John Maximovich, the Wonder Worker. And even during that time, Father Seraphim Rose and this other individual were accused of being homosexuals. I don't care to, attack them on the basis of things I don't know, but this is coming from familial sources as well as obviously the abuse accusations against Father Abbot Herman. But these guys were very, very close friends. New Age spirituality, which brought a lot of people into Rokor and Hesychasm and things like that. Now, if you look at the icon I have there, the thumb, you see one side is Jay Dyer with pagan heavy metal band T-shirt on that he's supporting. Jay has a lot of heavy metal friends like the people in Boiler Room. Heavy metal is very much part of the traditionalist fascist movement that's going on now. It's called Vasila. But on the other side, on the right half, I have World Movement is actually run out of Father Seraphim Rose's Saint Herman Alaskan Brotherhood. And get a article about that. But it adopts this kind of punk nihilist visual thematic. Let's see if I can find something on Alaskan Brotherhood here. It adopts these themes, right? And this was specifically designed to go out and rope in nihilist punk scene within California. But it's kind of an example of these new agey Orthodox type trying to adopt subcultures. So here's a Wikipedia article on it. Here's some zoomer to your Wikipedia investigation. Death to the World was started by monks and nuns from St. Herman of Alaska Monastery in Platina, California, as a medium of evangelization to teens involved in the punk subculture by monastics who were ex-punks. A founding member who was Justin Marler, who soon after recording Volume 1 with seminal doom metal band Sleep in 1991, left for 7 years of monastic life, while Sleep went on to become metal icons. So there's, once again, heavy metal connection with all these people. Um, the Fash Wave theme aesthetics that Jay Dyer is adopting is kind of in line with the strategies of Saint Herman of Alaskan Monastery, and I think strategies of things that people like Alexander Dugin are doing with um, trying to co-opt left and right movements, trying to co-opt religious cults. There's tons. If you look at Wrath of Anon, or Wrath of Anon, Wrath of Wrath of Gnon, Gnon, which is backwards for the god of nature. He adopts a certain kind of aesthetic, which is actually a little more, classical, but he's appealing to these kinds of people too. Um, just kind of nihilists who are also romantics and romanticizing the past, romanticizing the Middle Ages, etc. Despite the fact that his name is completely Masonic, and he's completely Masonic too. But this is something I see shared by people who are like in the soul of the East circles and around Orthodoxy, around traditional Catholicism. Just because they share Gregory Palamas here or there, they share G.K. Chesterton here or there. All of the people that we've been talking about, I think, in the last video too. Um, and I found one by the guy that wrote the Sophiology book that Benedict XVI translated into Russian. But that's why I have the little Fash Wave. I think it's a swastika on over top of Jay Dyer here. Uh, But going on about this movement, originally the monastics planned to submit an article about Father Seraphim Rose to a magazine, Maximum Rock and Roll. They later decided to try to place an ad for their monastery, but were rudely rejected, being told that the magazine only ran ads for music and zines. So they created a zine, which is like an internet magazine, and they created these kind of death metal looking words, "Death to the World." Um, in the thumbnail that I posted for the original stream, I that I thought I was going to do, I posted that read Death to the World and compare it to Joseph de Maistre, who has generally the idea of contramundum, and there's a book written about Joseph de Maistre called Contramundum, which means against the world. And they're comparing him to Athanasius, whereas Athanasius was contramundum because he was against the world in terms of the political agendas that were trying to compromise the church. It wasn't against worldly things or disdain for creation. But this magazine is literally called Death to the World, and it really matches the Demetrian idea, matches the Gnostic idea, which underlies all of these things. Um, so let me read that quote here by de Maistre. I might even just read the intro here because I think I sum things up better. Shit. YouTube's not letting me load this. I freaking hate this. I'm a wreck. Oh shit. No, I'm still up. Here we go. But remember, this is all coming out of where Jay Dyer draws the majority of his influence from. And we will at some point talk about. So Father Rose also created something that was rather considered a Gnostic theory, um, called the tollhouse theory, wherein after you die, you go through this series of like cosmic tollhouses, and you're judged by various demons. Um, and it's kind of like this Maistre uh, system where the demons are purifying you as you go into heaven. This was also something that comes from the Bogomils, who were a Gnostic sect in around with the Albigensians and all of these individuals, the Barlamites. Not the Barlamites. Hee hee. Uh oh, I let it slip, Jay. Oh no, he's got me now. Um, so here's the quote by Maistre: "The whole earth, perpetually steeped in blood, is nothing but a vast altar upon which all that is living must be sacrificed without end, without measure, without pause, until the consummation of things, until evil is extinct, until the death of death." Um, so I guess kind of the point is that Jay could be this extension of kind of the brothers of Saint Herman Alaskan Brotherhood, where he's now kind of he has like this ortho wave thing going on for him, but he still falls into this counterculture um, area, appealing to nihilists and other people who are getting outside of religion, with people like Nietzsche or whatever. Now, all of these people are part of the same kind of either Enlightenment or counter Enlightenment forces, which really were there to destroy the Renaissance and Renaissance ideas. And some people will say, "Oh, well, no, the Renaissance was the cause of all this," and I really have to object to that. But okay, let's continue reading on because there's some other good stuff in here. So this magazine called Death of the World is published and distributed at punk shows and underground hangouts. It was estimated that at one time there were 50,000 in circulation. The monastics put out 12 issues in all, after which they continued distributing the Zine, but didn't publish new issues. 8 years later, the Zine was revived by convert members of St. Barnabas Antiochian Church in Costa Mesa, California. New issues are submitted to the St. Herman monks for editing and revising and are released quarterly. The zine had considerable impact on the counterculture youth during the mid to the late 90s, which caught the attention of mainstream press and quickly led to the release of Justin Mahler's first book in 1997, Youth of Apocalypse. So here's another thing that's being promoted largely is this constant idea that there's an apocalypse coming. Um, and so you have apocalypse and Messiah, and the general idea is that the Messiah is going to be this physical king, this physical monarchy, the return to the Imperium, and obviously the only place where this can come from is from the Russians. So I think that's mostly what I wanted to talk about with Jay. We can get into deeper issues once I get these things reorganized, but there's just defending my freaking honor against Jay saying that Father Seraphim Rose had nothing to do with the Holy Order of Man or Gnosticism. Jay says, "Oh, Tollhouse theory is a Gnosticism." Uh, when so many other, I think even people within Rokor absolutely say this, um, and prove it too. Actually, let's see if we can look up that real quick. Tollhouse theory, Gnosticism, Rokor. Because why not? Okay, rooshjournal.org. This is the one that I've read before. Matthew Raphael Johnson wrote this. It's called The Problems with the Tollhouse Theory. The Earl Tollhouse theory debate is strange only in that it derives from the dream and a bizarre one at that. The dreamer is not a saint, and his actual identity is open to dispute. The sequence of events is related to the text of the tale of Theodora and the aerial tollhouse theories. Saint Theodora lived in Constantinople during the 10th century. A widow, she became a nun under Saint Basil the New and became a solitary. When she reposed at a great age, Gregory, a student, asked Basil to speak of the saintly nun's ascent to heaven. This Gregory fell asleep that night, and youth of comely appearance to him. This is supposed to be an angel. He said, "Come quickly, Father Basil summons you to visit Theodora." He quickly followed the angel while asleep and soon found himself in a labyrinth. Such a labyrinth is an ancient symbol of Gnostic initiation. In addition, Julius Evola argues that the toll gates are an essential and foundational element of Mithraic initiation. Now, Mithraic initiation is directly linked to Martinism, but because it's initiatory, somebody like Rene Guénon and Alexander Dugin has an entire essay on this, as well as Evola, that initiatory religions were pretty much destroyed by syncretic um, Christian organizations like Martinism or Rosicrucianism, Christian Freemasonry. So the last initiatory religion, and Dugin talks about this specifically as the point of why hesychasm, political hesychasm, must take over, is that it's the last initiatory religion in Christianity. Um, and similarly, my understanding of it is that it comes from Jewish Merkaba mysticism that may have been practiced by St. Paul, but it's definitely a Jewish mystic ritual that I don't think has much to do with Christianity. It might be a holdover from an old tradition, but that doesn't mean that it needs to be remain relevant, especially if it has aspects which are not Christian. And the biggest problem with it is how many people practice the same tradition and get the same results. Are they all viewing the divine light of God, the uncreated divine lights of God? Are the Sufis that practice the same thing, viewing the uncreated divine light of God? Um, I don't know. Maybe Jay Dyer will say they do. Uh, Variations of the toll gates, according to Evola, are discovered in most non and pre Christian movements. Well, that's also true um, that they're found there. Now, I think there's a lot of defense of him in here. Trying to figure out what Rocor says about it. Okay, so the toll house theory does take directly from Gnostic sects, though obviously inadvertently. Interestingly, the Rocor makes this admission. Rocor says, "Soul of one who on earth has completed the course of faith thereby frees itself from evil. The demons have nothing in common with it and cannot touch it. Between these two aspects of souls, sinful and the holy, there still stands various degrees of sanctity or sinfulness in various degrees. The demons may harry them. These actions, which must in no way be accepted as the participation of the demons in the preliminary judgment, are what are referred to as the toll house stations. Rejection of possibility of their existence contradicts the consciousness of the ancient church, as this is apparent from the canon of departure of the soul, minimizing the significance of the fear in the face of the consequences of his sinful life and after the departure of the soul from the body. Teaching of Father Levkin weaken in the souls of his readers one of the stimuli to do battle with sins." So then we say, author says, demons are not involved in a preliminary judgment, then what's the point of the toll house theory? The author asks. The final sentence above gives an answer. It's to make people afraid to die. With this torture ahead of them, the negative energy of fear will drive the person to life, righteous life. This comes very close to a total rejection of the theory. It exists or it seems to scare them. Simple. So, uh, there's something about Dostoevsky in this idea. There are two ways of viewing moral theology. The simplistic way is to borrow from judicial proceedings and treat God's judgments as similar to courtroom. Sins are acts that have to be forgiven in confession before one can enter heaven. This is a rationalist, bureaucratic view foreign to the faith. The other way is to treat sin as a state of mind. Men sin all the time. The greatest of saints say were the greatest sinners. Were they lying? Our acts are always sinful, but the state of mind is that which is judged. Even if our minds are the pinnacle of good order, we live in a sick and dying society where such a mind will still sin because it's mismatched with the social institutions with which it must function. It's similar to Dostoevsky's Idiot. Our postmodern world is a great machine that creates sinful desires and rewards these at least some of the time. It looks upon the aesthetic life with utter disdain. What happens when you place something pure into an evil environment? Um, Sin will no doubt occur as the holiest of souls fall under the relentless modern pressure to conform. All told, the tollhouse theory is problematic for many reasons. In my view, the most damning argument, pun intended, is that God's mercy is absent of, and demons are granted far more power than the faith allows. It is extremely crude. The tale of Theodora cannot be an Orthodox document. This that's the conclusion of this paper. Somewhere in here, it links it to the direct ancient um, origin of this idea, but I can't find it because this isn't my annotated copy. But if you want to look into this, it's a full debunking of the Toll House theory, and both Seraphim Rose and problems with Saint John the Wonder Worker. Um, so here it is. Father Seraphim, normally an excellent missionary, erred in the area that is very speculative and difficult. Father Michael is far too harsh and sweeping when he calls Seraphim a Gnostic. Having studied under Alan Watts before his conversion, Seraphim knew the difference between esoteria and exoteria. He knew the rituals and sacraments in Gnosticism are only for the uninitiated. It was Father Seraphim's devotion to St. John Masovich which led him to a specific and isolated error. The arrangement of the toll houses in the dream of Theodora are a powerful argument against the theory as a whole. They make absolutely no sense to an almost cosmic degree. Consider the 19th toll house, it deals with heresy. And then he discusses that and a bunch of other heresies. Somewhere, I'm just going to look for it right now. Maybe it's in the original, the freaking Zoomer tier Wikipedia article here. Let's see. I don't know. So, I mean, they make the further distinction, though, with these things that Gnostic beliefs are only things that are concealing information from the initiatory. At the same time, Alexander Dugin and Rene Guénon call Hesychasm the last remaining initiatory religion, at least in the Christian world. So, and Hesychasm is very similar to Sufi practices. Rene Guénon was a Sufist. A lot of the writers on Hesychasm, some of the writers anyway that I've found on Hesychasm tend to be writers on Sufism. Um, Sufism tends to weave its way in and out of all of these traditionalist groups, even within Catholicism. You have the son of, I think, Ananda Kumasari, the guy that created the concept of post-industrial society. He was part of these Islamic cultural congresses that were Sufist in nature. But what I'm trying to kind of show is, first of all, Jay Dyer is completely freaking wrong about Father Abbot Herman. His links to Seraphim Rose are extremely close, and Jay just kind of, oh, it's not true, and hey, and he's gonna say something like, hey, well, just because they're close, that's guilt by association. It's like missing the larger picture that this whole New Age cult of Orthodoxy comes out of the same kinds of things that we described in the last video. That comes out of Martinism and traditionalism, which is this idea that there needs to be this Christian syncretic global order, um, or at least how their traditionalism works is that the tradition must be appropriate to the geographical region. So it's not perennialism because in the West they want traditional Catholicism to reign, but they want it under this kind of Gnostic denial of reason heresy. The same thing, they like the ideas of Palamos, so they promote the ideas of Palamos over there. Nietzsche isn't the only person that inspired evil people, which is kind of what Dyer and Seraphim Rose, that's the thesis of nihilism, which is the book by um, Seraphim Rose. But if you look at the last video that we did, and I think I did put up the chart, you can kind of see the Russian Martinist circles and all of that, and how many of them were kind of inspired by Nietzsche and the concept and the interplay of the Apollinian Dionysian cult system, which Nietzsche talks about, and the idea of using that to um, as means of control, using that as themes in theater, using the theater as the new religion of people, things like this, all coming out of the Slavophile um, sophiology networks that were really kind of behind the initial 1905 revolution. Now, Bolshevism didn't like all of that, but we're going to read an EIR article that includes something else about Palamas. Essentially, the initial Palamas um, idea comes out of some of these bisexual cults. And you have kind of a which were like these aesthetic orders. Um, Comes out of a compromise. One of the early fathers of the Palamite tradition makes a compromise and says, well, we can keep some of these practices, but some of these have to go. And then this stuff gets forgotten, and later it gets published in Venice in 1782, around the time when Martinism came into Russia, Freemasonry came into Russia by um, the first Russian journalist, really, and the people around the Menshevik Tower Group, the Church of Archangel Gabriel. Menshevik Tower, if you ever played the Hitman series, I think in Hitman 2, Hitman Contracts, it's one that you can go up and snipe Soviet officials. Uh, so the head of Rosicrucianism in Russia at that time was Johann George Schwartz, and the first Russian journalist and one of the guys that translated all sorts of occult works into Russia was Nikolai Ivanovich Novikov. And so it's reasonable that Palamas was being promoted in Russia and in Europe at the same time. These things are being published in Venice at the same time. In Venice, if you remember correctly, Venice co-founded the Venetian Doge co-founded the Jesuits, and as much good as the Jesuits did on some level, the spiritual practices of the Jesuits are heavily influenced by the Palamite tradition, and I believe actually some of the Jesuit practices inspire the restorationists of the Hesychasm and Gregory Palamas and uh, the new theologian, whatever his name is. Well, we're going to read this article because I like it because it starts off with Thomas Merton, who some conservative Catholics, for some reason, think this guy is so great. Thomas Merton was like this heavily spiritual Catholic mystic that was basically just in league with Fabians and uh, William F. Buckley and those kinds of people. Okay. But this article goes into that the roots of Hesychasm to Bolshevism. And to make it clear, so we have the initial Hesychasm coming out of the Merkaba practices of St. Paul, which maybe were okay, but then being taken back out of this cult, which had like all sorts of weird crap going on. We're going to read about that. Then it's lost for a long time, and then in the counter enlightenment, or at the same time, you didn't have all these Jacobin type people. Like Leibniz wasn't a Jacobin. There were so many minds at that time that were not Jacobin type people. But this is what the counter enlightenment says: everybody was this anarchist, Freemason, liberal, and it's absolutely not true. Um, but during the counter enlightenment, you have the revival by the Slavophile networks of Hesychasm. And that goes up into the 1905. Some of the Hesychast individuals are thrown out as white emigre during the purges eventually, um, but some of them stay around, and a lot of them actually do influence Soviet culture predominantly and formulate what is called the Russian idea, which I demonstrated before, came out of the Sophiology circles in a work literally called The Russian Idea, I think published 1888. So this article is going to pick up there, and then we'll go back and look more into Hesychasm coming out of these strange cults, heretical cults. Optina Pustin, Revival is Returned to the Roots of Bolshevism by Alan and Rachel Douglas. It's EIR, April 22nd, 1988. It's curious the Russian Revolution was preceded not by a century of monastic decadence and torpor, but by the monastic golden age, wrote Thomas Merton, the American mystic. Curious it might seem, but it was entirely lawful in approving the revival of Optina Pustin Monastery. See Mother Russia EIR article, April 1st, 1988. Soviet authorities really are returning to the spiritual and political roots of collectivist Bolshevism. This resuscitation of the most prominent center of the 19th century Russian monastic movement presents us with an opportunity to reflect on the essential aspect of the prehistory of the Bolsheviks, which is little understood by strategic analysts. Those who believe that the revival of the Russian Orthodox Church means either the atheistic communism has been forced to dress itself in the garb of Russian nationalism or that Bolshevism has fundamentally changed will benefit from the acquaintance with the case of Optina Pustin. Each story illustrates well how the most momentous transformations in Russian history, like the dynastic shift that occurred in 1917, have been perpetuated by the old Russian landed aristocracy. who were mostly associated with Masonry and all of this. I have maybe by birthday of um, a work on that I'm going to look into. Some of these articles I think I'm just going to put in a series of videos and then order them as I see fit in a playlist. Um, so the landed aristocracy perpetuating 1917, always in collaboration with powerful forces from outside Russia. The most fervent Russian nationalist will cringe at the evidence that his passion for the blood and soil Holy Mother Russia is a synthetic belief structure cooked up by foreigners. At the beginning of the 18th century, Tsar Peter the Great had assailed the monasteries as sources of innumerable disorders and closed many of them, ending the hegemony in Russian cultural life, enjoyed by the monasteries since their proliferation in the 14th century. In the late 1700s, however, oligarchical families in Orthodox church circles from Venice and from the monastic center at Mount Athos in Greece, like I said, Venice has always considered itself Orthodox. That is why they had two, not one, patriarchate in Venice. Um, I had somebody say, "Oh well, why did Venice always go to war with the Byzantines?" And this is completely made up. The Venetians had like two wars with the Byzantines, and they were over like marauding rights and uh, trading rights. But whatever they were, they came to pretty good terms, and they ended on good terms. And the other thing is, like I said, with the Fourth Crusade, it's always a lie that the Catholic Church was behind it, because the Venetians, who are already considering themselves Byzantine, take a Byzantine emperor who has been deposed and back him and move into Constantinople uh, with these people to sack Constantinople. So it's Byzantines attacking Byzantines. The Fourth Crusade was an inside job. Uh, so these Venetian circles and Orthodox circles from around Mount Athos in Greece unleashed a new wave of rationalist Hesychasm movement into Russia. The old Venetian possessions in the Aegean, Chios, Hydra, Naxos, and Corfu were the staging ground for this campaign. It was to be the most important outside input to the recreation of the monastery dominated culture in the 19th century Russia in a prelude to the dynastic shift of 1917. As had been the case in the 15th century, the main mover of a highly organized irrationalist outburst was a member of the Byzantine nobility, Macarius, Archbishop of Corinth, from the Notaras family. Macarius and his collaborators compiled the Philokalia, a compendium of hesychastic writings from ancient works held in the libraries at Mount Athos. They were published in Venice beginning in 1782. Venice also famous for publishing the works of Martin Luther, also famous for co-founding the Jesuits and representing the Ultramontane faction. Well, the Russian court and the Academy of Sciences founded by Peter the Great, according to the plans drafted by the great German scientist and statesman Leibniz, were the scene of combat between Leibniz's heirs and the would-be apostles of the Enlightenment who flourished in Catherine the Great's reign, 1762 to 1796. The next more characteristic phase of Russian culture was prepared in the Phanariate, Greeks from the Ottoman Empire, districts of Moldavia and Wallachia, the area of modern-day Romania. There were the Russian monk Paisy Velikovsky trained more than 1,000 monks who would soon pour into Russia to populate the reopened monasteries with the sponsorship of Prince Potoyomkin and funding from the aristocratic Orlov family. So this is during the Enlightenment, verge of the Counter-Enlightenment. When Peter came to power in the 17th century, there were more than 2,000 monasteries. In 1762, there were only 318. With the monastic resurgence, the numbers reached 476 in 1825, 597 by 1850, 619 by 1879, and 783 at the beginning of 1902, 970 by 1907, and over 1,000 by 1917. Macarius Notarus and the Koli Vedis movement. In the second half of the 18th century, Mount Athos initiated a movement for a return to the strict practices of the 4th century Desert Fathers. This was known as the Kolivades movement. Together with the Kolivades' fervor for stricter adherence to sacred tradition, went an endeavor to revive and cultivate this mysticism known as Hesychasm. It was revived by Kolivades, particularly Macarius Nicodemos, the Philokalia, which is the compendium of Hesychasm, a monumental anthology of ascetical mystical writings by some 30 Greek fathers, which played a role of the first importance in the revival of Hesychasm in Greece. The other Balkan countries and Russia owed its publication to these two saints, reported the biographer of Macarius, Constantine Kavarnos. So, one thing about Hesychasm and these works is that they had to be translated from Greek into Russian. Okay. And the Enlightenment brought about most of your Russian translators. And you also had to have a unified Russian language, which I don't think happened until Alexander Pushkin came along. So take that into consideration. And I have some of my annotated stuff that I was reading where there's interesting aspects of who translated the Greek Hesychasm works into Russian. Directly linking it directly to these groups. Macarius of Corinth came from the family of the last Grand Duke of Byzantine Empire, Lucas Notaras, who was famous for having said, as Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, better to see the turban of the Turk ruling in the city than the Latin mitre. After taking charge of the Archbishop of Corinth in 1765, Macarius went to Athos to dig out the main works of Hesychasm. After arranging for their publication, he established a school of Hesychastic practice of Chios. Central to the Hesychastic revival, as it had been for the Hesychasts of the 14th and 15th centuries, was a death cult from which Macarius derived the title Trainer of Martyrs. One of the major works he got published in Venice was the New Martyrologium. Say it with me. Martyrologium, which glorified death at the hands of the infidels. Together with Macarius' teaching, according to Kavarnos, the Martyrologium had the effect of leading many to suffer martyrdom for the sake of the Christian faith. A good number of Greeks went to Macarius, attracted by his fame as a holy man, in order to prepare themselves for facing the great trial of martyrdom with unyielding fortitude. You see the same thing with Tradition, Family, and Property, which trains fascist combatants, or I mean, still today they do it. Now the Albert Einstein Institute is training them with Gene Sharp's tactics of nonviolence. But before then, especially in Brazil, um, they trained armed insurgents. EIR has a picture of some TFP members using a picture of John Paul II as target practice. Um, they were running around collecting donations from landholders in Brazil to stop agrarian reform, which is probably the main reason they exist down there, is to protect the Braganza, who is the part of the Turn and Taxes Habsburg family landholdings down there, and basically to keep colored people from getting, which means browner than they, because they're already kind of brown, from getting land and stopping development of the country in the midst of food shortages, mind you. But there's this heavy emphasis in all these traditionalist movements of training future martyrs, people that are going to die and fight in these sectarian wars for the faith. And we'll also talk about the trained assassin, Father Crone, who was former SSPX, because today he's a protected asset, despite the fact that he tried to assassinate both the King of Spain and the King of Belgium. He is now a superstar of the Spanish New Right. And we'll do a specific video on that, because that's incredible. It's unbelievable. So you have this martyrology school. Compare that to Steve Bannon's idea for a gladiator school out of Regensburg Castle now. I think he got kicked out of the Carthusian monastery that he was initially putting it into. So these neo-martyrs felt that the only boldly affirming their faith in Christ before a Muslim authorities could be fully cleansed of their sin. The new Martyrologium was published Venice 1799, celebrated the number of Orthodox martyrs who had volunteered in this way to be tortured or decapitated. The chief editor of Macarius' publishing project on Hesychasm was St. Nicodemus the Hagiorite from 1749 to 1809, who sent a steady stream of books of Gregory Palamas, St. Simeon the New Theologian, and other hesychasts to Venice to be printed. But Nicodemus used not only the Eastern spiritual fathers. To this day, there is a great embarrassment in Orthodox circles over the fact that a great Orthodox theologian drew inspiration from Western sources. These were Ignatius Loyola's spiritual exercises and the spiritual combat of Lorenzo Scopoli, a Venetian-dominated reform order of the Theatines. So let's read this again, because J. Dyer doesn't like this. The chief editor of Macarius' publishing project on hesychasm was St. Nicodemus the Hagiorite, 1749 to 1809, who sent a steady stream of books of Gregory Palamas, St. Simeon the New Theologian, and other hesychasts to Venice to be printed. But Nicodemus the Hagiorite used not only the Eastern spiritual fathers. To this day, there is a great embarrassment in Orthodox circles over the fact that this great Orthodox theologian drew inspiration from Western sources. These were Ignatius Loyola's spiritual exercises, the Jesuits, and the spiritual combat of Lorenzo Scopoli, a member of the Venetian-dominated reform order, the Theatines. They had been two of the most important figures relied upon the 16th century Venetian Gasparo Contarini and his friends in their attempts to expunge the influence of the Renaissance from Western Christianity. And Contarini was the guy that simultaneously approved of Luther's doctrines on justification while also being the one who convened the Council of Trent, supposedly against Luther. Fanning out from the Mount Athos and Colivades, established schools all over the ancient positions of Venice and the Aegean to train proselytizers for the entire Orthodox East. Macarius met with various Phanariot nobles to arrange financing. John Mavrocordatos of Dragomon, Greek interpreter or powerful civil servant, that's what his name means, Mavrocordatos, in the Ottoman Empire family, put up funds for the first publication of the Philokalia in Venice. 1782. The core of the new doctrine was ancient hesychastic practice, ceaseless repetition day and night of the Jesus prayer. Lord Jesus, have mercy upon me, a sinner. While breathing is coordinated with the timing of these words, the purpose was to obliterate mind altogether, was described by a Russian practitioner in the time, listen to me, a sinner, I revealed to you a secret. After my arrival at Niamitu Monastery, hearing from Starets Paisius about hesychast prayer, I began to experiment with it. This prayer appeared to me to be so sweet that I liked it above everything else in the world. For this reason, I isolated myself from my brethren. I loved silence and went off into solitude, avoiding all scandals and particularly vain talk. For the sake of this prayer, I often become a recluse. I spent all my strength in order to attain it, even to the point of prostration. Many years passed by in this kind and loving, and little by little the prayer began to deepen. I sleep hardly 1 hour and 24, and then sitting. When I rise again, it seems as if I'd never slept, and even when I sleep, my heart is watching. If I wish, I can sleep without stopping. Often I rise in the evening to read the Psalms or say the prayer of Jesus, and I become enraptured, drawn out of myself I know not where, in the body or out of the body. I do not know. God knows. Only when I come to myself, it is already light. But a sting of the flesh is given to me to disturb me, to keep me humble. In no wise can I be with people, still less with laymen. With women I cannot even talk. For more than 40 years in Moldavia, no woman has visited me, although many wanted to have talk with me, but I refused, saying that I am ill. Quoted Sergius Bolshakov, Russian Mystics, Cistercian Publications, Inc., 1977. Alexander Benningsen, the Orthodox bread specialist in Sufism, has compared the Russian Orthodox technique of the Jesus prayer to the Sufi practice of zikr, which also employs the hyperventilation in pursuit of ecstasy. And that's I think that might be one of the works that I annotated and highlighted. I just have screenshots of it now. So we might go through some of that stuff later. Starets Paisy Velikovsky, the chief importer of revived hesychasm to the Russian monasteries from Mount Athos and the Venetian strongholds of Aegean, was the Russian monk Paisy Velikovsky. In the words of Thomas Merton, the great novels of Dostoevsky keep before the Russian masses, and especially the youth, the image of Christ in the figures of the Russian straits. The great Optino Stratsy, whose influence on the life of many prominent Russians like Gogol, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Leontiev, Soloviev, and Rosanov was very considerable, were themselves disciples of another Straits, Paisy Velikovsky, who initiated in his Niemtu monastery in Moldavia the astonishing revival of Russian monasticism in the 19th century, which became the golden age of Russian mysticism. And several of those characters, and I had, if you've seen on the other video, um, the working progress chart that I have of the influence of Martinism on the Sophiology circles and the immediate cultural movement preceding the Bolshevik Revolution. Many of these individuals are right there, including Vladimir Solovyov. Fyodor Dostoevsky himself paid homage to Velikovsky and the irrationalist methods of the Starsky elders, which Velikovsky reintroduced to Russia in the following passage from the brothers Karamazov. I must digress to explain what an elder is in the Russian monasteries. Authorities on the subject assert that the institution of the elders is recent date, not more than 100 years old in our monasteries, although in the Orthodox East, especially in Sinai and Athos, it existed over 1,000 years. It was revived among us towards the end of the last century by one of the great ascetics, as they called him, Pasi Velikovsky, and his disciples. It flourished especially in the celebrated Kozaletsky Optin Monastery, Optina Pusin, which is what this article is about. Our monastery had flourished and began glorious all over Russia only because of its elders, and pilgrims had flocked for thousands of miles from all parts to see and hear them. What was such an elder? An elder was one who took your soul, your will, into his soul and his will. When you chose an elder, you renounced your own will and yielded to him in complete submission, complete negation. This novitate, this terrible school of abnegation, undertaking voluntarily in the hope of self conquest, of self mastery, in the order after a life of obedience to obtain perfect freedom that is from self. Like their spiritual heirs, the Bolshevik collectivists, the Starsky obliterated the sanctity of the individual soul, his free will, and creativity. Born in the Ukraine in 1722, Velikovsky traveled to Mount Athos in the 1740s in search of a more spiritual life than that of the relatively Latinized Russian Orthodox Church, as it was in the wake of Peter's reforms. There he adopted Hesychasm. These practices began being banned in Russian monasteries subject to St. Peter, Tsar Peter's edicts. Velikovsky set up shop in the Phanariot-run districts of Romania. His sponsor, the Phanariot Prince Constantine Marusu, gave him the largest monastery in Moldavia, Niematu, which had been historically closely tied to Russian monasticism. The Russian monasteries, which controlled vast holdings in Russia since their establishment in the 15th and 16th centuries, were extraordinarily important centers, handing the largest of them to Velikovsky was a big boost for the Hesychasm project. Velikovsky trained a virtual army of 1,000 monks in the ways of ancient desert fathers. They studied, besides the Philokalia, the writings of leading Byzantine opponents of the Western Church's doctrine of the procession of the Holy Spirit, equally from the Father and the Son. Velikovsky himself, in the letter of the Uniate priest on the procession of the Holy Spirit, railed against the Filoloque clause in the Creed. 1790, during the Second Russo-Turkish War, Russian commander-in-chief Prince Georgy Potemkin sent his personal Archbishop Ambrosi to visit Velikovsky at Niemtu. Ambrosi officially approved ties between Velikovsky's Moldavian monasticism and Russian monasticism and raised Velikovsky to the rank of Archimandrite. With the death of Catherine in 1796, the Velikovsky trained hesychasts poured back into Russia. They became abbots of existing monasteries and set up new ones all over the country, where they reintroduced the Hesychastic prayer and the institution of the Straits. Over 160 monasteries had the immediate disciples of Paisley or their pupils. Potemkin's own son was a Hesychastic monk of Velikovsky's school. The biggest political and financial patron of the monastic expansion after the death of Pottoykin in 1791 was Countess Anna Orlova Chesmenkaya. 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 She was the only child of Count Alexei Orlov Chesma. Venetian tied Orlov, who was granted the right to add Chesma to his title for his role in the Russians' first major naval victory over the Turks. Anna Orlov Chesmenkaya bequeathed 5,000 rubles to each of the 340 monasteries, besides larger donations to selected other monasteries. She also sponsored the notorious patriarch Photius, who presided over a resurgence of Russian Orthodoxy in court circles after Tsar Alexander I was won by his Veneria aide Alexander Sturza and others to a mystical belief in Russia's divine mission during the period um, at which the Holy Alliance was contrived. Leontiev's design. The home base of Velikovsky's hesychasm was Optina Pusin, established by disciples of the Kaluga province, central Russia. It became historian James Billington's reported in the Icon and the Axe, a center of counseling and of spiritual retreats for many of the Russians' most famous 19th century thinkers, beginning with the Slavophile Ivan Kharivsky, who spent much of his time there, and extending on through Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and Vladimir Solovyov, who is probably, I think he's the guy that came up with the Russian idea, right? Yep, yep. Solovyov is publishes the Russian idea in 1888, inspired by Dostoevsky. Um, so this is the guy that slept with multiple muses named Sophia, one of the most important Sophiologists. He had a syncretic philosophy of orthodoxy with Kabbalah. He was a campaigner for Jewish culture. He supported Roman Catholicism. This is the Venetian, uh, and back and forth he went between orthodoxy and nihilism. This is the Venetian link of this kind of traditional uh, identity politic resurgence that you're seeing today. Like the Venice is putting out this hesychasm, um, these hesychasm works. Venetian nobility, Russian Venetian nobility are putting out these hesychasm works, funding all of the monasteries, and you have this character critical to it, Solovyov, who's both going around and rallying support for Russian Roman Catholicism, while also supporting Orthodoxy, but trying to muddy Orthodoxy with the Kabbalah and syncretic philosophy. And this is typical of um, people associated with Martinism and Freemasonry, the Christian traditionalist wing of Freemasonry, which is Martinism, uh, uh, Rosicrucianism, whatever. The spiritual son of Optini Starsky, the elders, who besides Dostoevsky most foreshadowed the Bolsheviks to come, was Konstantin Leonev. He would work for 6 years as official censor at the Moscow Censorship Board, directed by the Okhrana, secret police. It was the ideas taught by the Starsky, the elders of the system, as the Catholic system, that got the stamp of approval for Leonev from the Okhrana, the same Okhrana whose masters of provocation did so much to build the Bolshevik Party and bring it to power. Nicholas Berdayev, another one of the people involved in this, shared with was also in the Russian symbology, 1905 Russian symbologist, St. Petersburg Salon, but also a Sophiologist. major influence on J. Dyer's friends at Soul of the East, along with Solyov, and also two very influential Alexander Dugin's um, Russian Messianic fourth political theory. Nicholas Berdayev, a later devotee of Leontiev, this Okhrana Hesychast controlled agent, uh, says the elders approved of Leontiev's inner spiritual development and looked upon him as a true Orthodox Christian. Almost everything he wrote received the elders, and this elder's name is Ambrose, blessing. Of its kind, this was a unique phenomenon in the history of Russian literature. This and subsequent quotations from Berdayev on Leontiev Academic International Press from 1968, all emphasis are on Leontiev's original. Raised in a noble family, Leontiev went to Crete in 1865 explicitly to get away from the increasing penetration of the bourgeoisie spirit in Russia through the growth of industry in cities in favor of the picturesque and backwards Levant. When living in Turkey, he later recalled, I very quickly learned a bitter truth. I was horrified and saddened to discover that the strength of certain Slav and Orthodox elements in the East was due entirely to the Turks. I began to suspect that for want of anything better, the Muslim tyranny could, in spite of its viciousness, be a source of strength for Slav characteristics, that without its consolidating pressure, the dissolving influence of Europeanism would become still more troublesome. The dissolving influence of Europeanism meant the threat to crippling mysticism of orthodoxy from reason as an efficient force for the progress of the world. And remember this from the perspective that God created reason. Christ is critical to reason. It's not something that's separate or outside of the Christian order. So, how it could not be a good from which man can benefit, as the radical traditionalists say, of Joseph the Maistre variety, who knows? Or the those that deny, or those that say that the only way to come to the right theology is by repenting, as the Orthodox say, the Palamites say. This is what they're against: Europeanism, reason, whatever, and not the reason that was put on the throne of Napoleon's church. French Revolutionary Church, Notre Dame. This was most hated by the Optina elders, who were indulgent to personality but merciless to the temptation and illusions of earthly progress and prosperity. Lyubnev, like his elders, believed evil passions are better in monks than lofty but unsuitable and important principles. It is even essential for higher ends of monkhood, and the majority of monks should be imperfect and sinful. We'll talk about holy fools in the Orthodox Church as well at some point, where they encourage monks to sin, to prove their humility. If all monks were like angels in fact, as well as in an inspiration or ideal, then the monarchies would be unable to produce their saints, their great ascetics, and their elders. For Leontiev, how can there be any new ways? I have no doubt of those of the dogmatic and aesthetic orthodoxy which have resisted science and progress. Indeed, it would be foolish to worship the orthodoxy of progress, the idol of progressive movement, having first of all denied every positive and restricting mystical orthodoxy as a sign of naivety and backwardness. I have the right to despise such a pallid and unworthy humanity with vices. Without vices, it is true, but without virtues also, and I have no wish to do anything to help such progress. Leontiev by no means confined such meditations to the monastery, for as Berdayev reported, the problem of Russia, that of her destiny and vocation, was the main theme of Leontiev's speculation and a constant source of anxiety for him. A few of his dicta on this theme were, I believe now that were Russia to put herself at the head of some new Oriental state, she would give the world a new culture, a new Slav Oriental civilization, in place of declining Romano German civilization. He also says we must have a faith in further development of Byzantine Christianity and the fruitlessness of the Turanian strain in our blood. He says we Russians must absolutely get off the European rails and blazing a new trail for ourselves. We must ultimately direct the mental and social life of mankind. He says to arrest the march of peoples along the path of anti Christian progress, to postpone the advent of the Antichrist, it is essential to keep Tsarist power strong and alive. In truth, however, Leontief very much doubted, given how much Western principles had already intruded into Russia, that preservation of anti-progress orthodoxy were possible under Tsarist power. Leontief had early grasped the fact, um, Berdyaev wrote, and he has grasped it better than others, that socialism would have the effect of transforming humanism into anti-humanism. Therefore, he preferred socialism to liberalism and democracy. In his opinion, socialism was performing an unconscious service for the reactionary organization of the future. So, just like Joseph de Maistre, they egg on the worst individuals, like Joseph de Maistre, egging on the executioner, calling the executioner basically God, egging on the Jacobin terror. It's the same kind of Cathar understanding, the worship of Polybius, a political cycle, um, of this eternal return. And in that sense, it's all Nietzschean. He supports socialism because it will faster expose, in his opinion, humanism, turn into anti humanism, and create a reactionary organization of the future in line with Middle Ages Orthodox uh, ideology. Going on, approximately 35 years before the Russian Revolution, Optina Pushkin's Leontev, reflecting a game master's knowledge of how things must transpire in a brutal Orthodox society, made this prediction. If liberalism were a little more widespread, it would bring about an explosion, and the so called Constitution would be the surest way of putting us under a socialist yoke, of inciting the poorer classes to fight the rich, the landowners, the bankers, and the merchants. It would be a new and even more terrible Pugatchev revolt, which was a 18th century peasant uprising. It is surprising that well meaning men should wish to see a czar power limited in the hopes of pacifying Russia. It is well known that Russia's is impervious to common sense. It is naturally inclined to the extremes. Thus, if the power of the monarchy were to lose its absolute significance, and if people were to grasp that it was no longer ruled by sovereigns, but by deputies elected according to the system of voting they did not understand, less even the workers of other countries, then this people would reach the stage of believing that it had outgrown its obedience. At this very moment, the people is weeping in the churches for its assassinated emperor. Not only would it not weep for the elected deputies, but it would claim as much soil and as wealth as possible. Berdyaev, looking back, observed, Leontiev's wish came true. A Pugachev revolt did triumph over a lawful and pacific constitution. As it was to happen, the masterminds of the Russian revolutions carried out just such a downgrading of the sovereign. The desacralization of the Tsar, they called it, as Leontiev described, like him and the other Starseeds of the Optina Pusin, they knew just what the effect would be. The Bolsheviks, the new Turk, would be brought in to preserve, after a minor pause, orthodoxy and to preserve the mission of the Holy Russia in the world. And thus you have eventually, as Rokor says, Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia says, you have Stalin running and the KGB running the Russian Orthodox Church. And even some of these white emigre helped with the Russian Revolution before 1917. Uh, Actually, most of the Russian symbolists which were associated with these people. were pro revolution, even though they were all steeped in these ideas of orthodoxy. One of them, an Orthodox saint named Maria Skoptsova, who was part of the 1905 Symbolist Salon, was an aristocrat uh, in the French Resistance. After she moved to Paris, because there's this direct connection between Russian Martinism and the symbology movements that grow out of Martinism. And so they end up being in the same places, Paris and St. Petersburg. Uh, this Maria Skoptsova is an Orthodox saint who plotted the assassination of Trotsky after he closed the Socialist Revolutionary Party. Um, Said she was the Bolshevik mayor of Anapa, and she died in a gas chamber trying to help Jews during the Holocaust. Alexander Bloch, who was part of this group, he wrote an Iconium to Mikhail Bakunin, who was the Jewish anarchist that took over I think it's the first Socialist International, and basically made Marx into an anarchist, which Marx wasn't really, um, was closely aligned with Maxim Gorky, who created some of the worst of Soviet art, the worst features of Soviet art. Konstantin Somov, who was a homosexual who painted Alexander Bloch's poems. He also moved to Paris. Uh, you had Vsevolod Meyerhold, who was a Soviet film director killed in Great Purge. He was Stanislavski's intellectual heir. He comes out of this salon. Vyacheslav Ivanov, like Berdayev, was also a Sophiologist and also in the 1905 Russian Symbolist Salon. He's notable for switching between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, and also I think he willingly goes from being a Dionysian to an Apollyon. I think that's part of his works. I think he's one of the major uh, political philosophers behind Dugin's work too. Um, there's just so much stuff like this. This needs to be a book, really. The snippets need to be put together, and the entirety of these groups need to come together. I've almost never seen a historical work that actually looks at a salon where you have all these people in the same room and doesn't and tries to show how they all influenced each other. You almost never see that. There's never like an exhaustive list. You can find stuff like that kind of on a Wikipedia article, but it's not exhaustive enough because they just give little summaries of things. It's almost never arranged that way though. Um, but so we read this, so we find where the origins of these giant tomes of the Palamite fathers come from. And like I said, now, like I promised, now we're going to go and look at the origins of these initial beliefs. Now, like I said, to be fair, part of the beliefs come from the Merkaba Jewish practices, Jewish prayer practices of St. Paul. Likely that he practiced these things. Simply as an adaptation of the rituals of the old law. See if I can find it in here. This is the one on Sufism. Oh, here's something about holy. Man, I have so much good material that I have to dig through now. I think this is the same article, though. Man, I don't know where I put this thing. That's all my expose on tradition and action. That's it. Yeah, so if you want to see the similarities between Hesychasm and Sufism, Sayyid Hossein Nasser wrote The Prayer of the Heart in Hesychasm and Sufism. I think this is a work about, I have a work about political hesychasm and how it integrates dark mysticism and light mysticism. Okay, here it is. So hesychasm, I'm gonna get the source for this. Um, Usually, when I screenshot something, it has the title in the file name, but this one's just called download, and I didn't name it download. It's just a dumb way they set up the website. So, Homoousian asceticism was characterized by the mingling of ascetics of both sexes in accordance with neither male nor female of Galatians 3:28. The purity of this kind of asceticism was ensured by women wearing men's clothes and shaving their heads. The former custom recalls Plato's female disciple Axiotheo. The bisexual habit of the Euthysians, Eustathians, Eustathians continued in some circles despite official reprimands at least until 1787. Yeah, 1787. 787. That's AD 787 AD. Some insights into the type of asceticism is gleaned from Aphrodite's demonstration of the Bani Quayama, the Sons of the Covenant, an aesthetic group that was not above agitation during the Christological crisis of the 5th century. The Sons of the Covenant, who comprised both male and female members, were regarded as more dedicated than the rest of the Christian community. There were two entities in the band, the Bethul virgins and the Qadish, holy laymen and holy women who abstained from sexual intercourse in accordance with Exodus 19:10. Basil owed much to Homoousian. This is Saint Basil the Great. Basil owed much to the Homoousian asceticism, but he rejected its tendency to mingle the sexes, and he was subsequently viewed as the true founder of monasticism in the Asia Minor. He also came to believe that Eustathius's ideas were too harsh and elitist. These ideas are reflected in the Syrian book of the steppes, Kitaba Damasquata, which envisions a dichotomy between the upright who are fed on milk and the perfect who are fed on the solid food of aestheticism. Eustathius' followers would go so far as to say that married Christians could not be saved, but Basil did not think that Christians who did not practice asceticism were inferior to those who did, although he felt that asceticism was. Shit. I gotta find this. But so Saint Basil is considered one of the main founders, I think, main apologist for monasticism and what becomes Hesychasm, and he comes from this Homoousian aesthetic cult. Elitist cult. Now, like I said, he makes a compromise to where he's not practicing this elitism that I think is now going to be uh, encouraged by people like Alexander Dugin, because Dugin has this whole thing concerning Rene Guénon, who was a disciple of Joseph de Maistre, about initiatory and counter-initiatory religions. And their concept is that Hesychasm is the last Christian initiatory religion. And I think that's one of the reasons they want to use it, because you have this elder system that can be used to control people into a wider geopolitical objective of political hesychasm, which is a very complex thing, but it's part of Alexander Dugin's fourth political theory. And we have the Russian Orthodoxy and Initiation article written by Alexander Dugin, where he's talking about Rene Guénon. We'll talk about that. I need to organize this stuff a little bit better before we go on, but I guess the great thing about these expository videos is that I can go back and write an outline and then piece together articles and maybe publish things that are a little more concise, or even just do concise recap videos. Give me 2 seconds. The Dyerites have turned off the light of Tabor, so I'm in the dark here. Alexander Dugin, the Russian Orthodoxy and Initiation. I think this is where we're going to stop. I think I kind of demonstrated the origins of hesychasm. Along the lines of what I said, and remember, kind of the start with Saint Basil and this cult system. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into that, maybe even after this video. I'll just collect stuff together real quick. But it comes out of this extremely radical cult in the Mideast. So, Russian Orthodoxy and Initiation by Alexander Dugin. Our study of sacred geographical layout of Russia. Oh, and hold on. Before we get into further geographical geopolitics, Dean Arnold is J. Dyer's godfather in the Orthodox Church. I think with his confirmation into the Orthodox Church. And Dean Arnold has this strange hobby that connects geographical areas with spirits. So let's see if I can find his thing and tell you exactly what that hobby's called. Shoot. And Jay has Dean Arnold on all the time. See if I can find his website. It's like land deliverance or something like that. Like has to do with terrain. But I think Dean Arnold, he's a published author. I think he's probably one of the guys that really helps Jay publish his books. It's like, how dumb do you have to be? He's not dumb. He's probably not dumb. He's probably the smartest guy in the world. But, like, get your search terms. He's another Soul of the East guy, too. Get your search terms put into Google so that you're the first thing that comes up. Like, I I thought this guy was supposed to be some sort of FSB genius. I can't even find him. All right, so about Dean World info, bio. Oh yeah, and this guy's books are like reviewed by U.S. Senator Bob Corker. Let's see. What the heck? Bio, not welcome. There we go. Well, let me go to his bio. What the heck? Okay. Spiritual mapping. So that's what I was thinking of. Spiritual mapping. But it's, I think, one of these other mystic occult things. And this is Jay Dyer's godfather and a good friend of the Soul of the East crowd and Jay. Oh my goodness. How many layers of investigation do I have to go through here? Yeah, it's dealing with terrestrial spirits. But it kind of fits in with some of the things that, not Volksgeist, but in general, soul, blood and soil politics. Like there's a spirit that comes out of the land and influences the culture and things like that, and also um, things like sacred geographical layout of Russia, uh, as Alexander Dugin here says. So that was an interesting thing. But anyway, going on. Our study of the sacred geographical layout of Russia and, in a broader sense, Eurasia, has led to the necessity of considering the purely religious aspect of Russian uniqueness, for example, the aspect directly connected to the Orthodox Church, in which one of the most important elements of the identity of the continent of Russia is concentrated. The vastness of such topic compels us to choose but a single layer of the problem and determine an angle that will form the basis of our study. We believe that the most essential and most interesting perspective would be a consideration of the specificity of the Russian Orthodox Church in context of Rene Guénon's works. In order to accomplish this, or more precisely, in order to lay groundwork for such an approach, which would offer unlimited possibilities for deep and unexpected understanding of Russian Orthodoxy, we must first briefly outline the most important propositions of Guénon in regards to exotericism, esotericism, initiation, and counter-initiation. Basing ourselves on these provisions, we can then better and more clearly grasp the secret of Russia and the meaning of its historical mission. Heading: Religion and Initiation according to Guénon. According to Guénon tradition, the entirety of sacred knowledge dating back to the primordial and inhuman divine source has, in the final period of our cycle in the Kali Yuga, which has already been counted down for several millennia, been divided into two parts: exotericism and esotericism. Exotericism can manifest itself in the form of religion: Judaism, Christianity, Islam, or non religious form, Hinduism, Confucianism, Buddhism, and represents the socio psychological ordering aspect of tradition, the face of tradition oriented exclusively outwards towards people and made available to all members of traditional society without exception. Esotericism, for its part, is purely spiritual sphere. On this level, tradition appeals to the elite and the chosen, who have been called to go deep inside the sacred doctrines and myths. Esotericism is the underside of tradition, while esotericism remains the outer side. So the doctrines of Rene Guénon didn't really like these Eastern, like Hinduism, Confucianism, and Buddhism, and instead prefers, like I said, um, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, other religions native to their land, um, And I mean, in line with the integralists and people that want confessional states and all these things, that is the religion that will be there. And there's an insistence on their traditionalism as at least exoterically, because that is the basis for society in their eyes. And they believe that then, therefore, you have to be have the esoteric aspect of this reveal um, the inhuman divine source, the primordial inhuman divine source. Um, Dugan continues, religious society conventionally has two types of rituals intended for the induction of the neophyte into the bosom of the sacred. The first is acceptance into an exoteric organization, conversion, and the second is initiation, this time into an esoteric organization. Initiation is the foundation of esotericism, and in certain cases it can be constructed not only as a ritual but as a complex of associated esoteric and symbolic doctrines, or even as a manifestation of concrete spiritual influences exceeding the scope of the outer exoteric tradition. According to Guénon, the existence of precisely such a dual structure in traditional society is a necessary condition for any society to be considered normal and fully fledged. Remember, Rene Guénon and Alan Watt, who is a disciple of Gurdjieff, who was a disciple of Rene Guénon. Um, both the major mentors um, to Seraphim Rose. Also, St. John the Wonder Worker, Maximovich, um, with the Gnostic tollhouse theory that Seraphim Rose uh, perpetuates, which is more of an esoteric doctrine. Um, he esoteric or exoterically talks about, but is more of an esoteric doctrine. Um, Subheading: the uniqueness of Christianity. Dugan's perspective. Such a schematic presentation, however, requires special explanation in regards to Christian religion. Guénon believed that the Christian tradition, unlike Judaism and Islam, was originally incomplete, possessing only an esoteric and initiatic level. As evidenced of this cited in the absence of consideration in the New Testament of any legal or social dimension which constitutes the essence of any exotericism. Only in later eras did Christianity descend to the exoteric level in adopting the socio-religious basis of a revised code of Roman law. The original and essential esotericism of Christian tradition should be borne in mind in order to understand the further considerations. The Shiite problem through the lens of Henry Corbin. The image of tradition divided into internal and external spheres is particularly applicable in the special case of Shiism and the Islamic tradition. The most authoritative Western scholar in Islam, Henry Corbin, pointed out this very interesting feature of Iranian Islam, which is by and large Shiite. On the one hand, Shiite Islam is replete with numerous explicit references to esotericism, and the foundation of Shiite doctrine particularly rests on the recognition of the central place of the light of the imamate and the sacred mission of Ali, the first of the imams who figured corresponds to the deeply esoteric level of the Muslim religion. On the other hand, Sufi initiatic organizations are the least widespread of all Shiism. Corbin asserts that the Shiite Sufism is rare encounter, and thus Shiite Islam does not comply with the norm of the strict division of the tradition into external and internal planes, as in case of Sunni Islam. Quran himself, however, reorganized that Iranian Islam was a special phenomenon, and he associated it with the absence of bans on the depiction of humans or animals in sacred art. Such bans are strictly observed in Sunni Islam, with the specific Aryan origin of the Iranians, who, in comparison to Semites, are much less inclined towards idolatry. In Shiism, in particular in Iranian Shiism, we are thus dealing with an esoteric tradition more open and less formalized or institutionalized than at Tasawwuf and Sufism. In the case of extreme Shiism, Islamism, uh, this is totally evident given the virtual absence of any exotericism at all. It should also be noted that Iranians occupy the more eastern geographical and intellectual regions of the Islamic Ummah, or in more general terms, the Caliphate. Let us recall the Oriental theosophy of Suwardi. Subheading: Orthodoxy in the East. Taking the above mentioned into account, an analogy can be suggested between Catholicism and Sunniism, or on the other hand, Orthodoxy and Shiism on the other. First, unlike Catholicism, it is practically impossible to record any special esoteric organizations in the history of the Eastern Church, whether Hermetic orders, companionships, or Gnostic brotherhoods. Despite the absence, however, their esoteric underpinnings of orthodoxy can be clearly traced and are evident in sacred architectural churches, initiatic iconography, and widespread apophatic theology, which was practically erased by exoteric Catholicism with the introduction of the dogma of the Filioque. Gee whiz. Hmm. As well as in monastic contemplative practices and hesychasm, the old believers and traditions of the holy fools, etc. Now, if anybody's a holy fool, it's Jay Dyer. I love Jay Dyer. I love to watch Jay Dyer. I watch every Jay Dyer video that comes out practically. But Jay kind of admittedly is a holy fool. And it's a strange dogma in the Orthodox Church, which encourages people to sin. And we've heard already how Leontief talks about that some monks should be great sinners because it is a matter of humility, but it's better for the monks to be sinners than the monarchs, which it doesn't make any sense. Like it's some sort of zero sum game. But anyway, secondly, Orthodoxy never evolved into a purely social religion, but remained above this level. The Orthodox patriarch, unlike the Pope, is the first and foremost the spiritual center of the Church, and who does not directly influence public and political life. The social role of the Roman Pope was indeed the subject of severe criticism of Catholicism expressed by the Orthodox. It can be said that this descent of Christianity into society which existed in the West never happened in the East. In some sense, the Ghibelline archetype was realized in Russia, with the sacred emperor as the center of the state and the patriarch fulfilling strictly sacred functions. And here we get the Guelph Ghibelline controversy with Hildebrand um, and Henry V, that eventually turns into the Black Guelphs versus the White Guelphs, and the Ghibellines aren't really heavily involved anymore. Um, where you have the White Guelph around Florence that support the papacy but are anti-Venetian, and you have the Black Guelphs who support secretly Orthodoxy and then radical ultramontanism, while also producing all of these atheist monks that go on to inspire British philosophers and other individuals. And it's interesting that Alexander Dugin's talking about this, which means he actually has some sort of grasp of history. This is something that generally people forget about history, and it's critical to understanding medieval history is the Guelph Ghibelline controversy, because eventually Florence is what produces the Filioque doctrine, which produces the Renaissance, and which produces a general idea around nation statism, because it believes that man is capable of reason, just as Christ is capable of generating the Holy Spirit. Uh, the man is capable of like holy reason, is what I was saying. Uh, and it's that Blackwell faction which represents the Malaspina family, who are papacidal. Like I said, killed popes, kidnapped popes, I believe. Uh, it's the crest that's on tradition, family, and properties crest. That is the Malaspinas, which literally mean I think it means bad thorns, thorny tree. Which I think there's a biblical thing about that, just as wealth means wolf. I think there's a biblical thing about wolves in sheep's clothing. Um, now, going on with Dugin here. Thirdly, this Ghibelline archetype mentioned above was embodied in the sacred attitude towards the Russian czars. It was the czar who was the sacred center of the Russian imperial ecumene, whose figure was concentrated all of the imminent religious energies of the empire's peoples. Unlike Catholic eschatology, in which the anti-pope and usurpation of the throne of St. Peter are discussed in an apocalyptic sense, Orthodox prophecies never mention an anti-patriarch. Instead, all negative counter-sacred forces are gathered in the singular personage of the anti-czar, the antichrist emperor. In principle, this Ghibelline aspect is typologically close to the Shiite understanding of the sacred nature of authority, as Shiite doctrine, unlike Sunni, insists on the rule of only the Aliyyites, the sacred descendants of the first of the Imams. The Shiites believe that no one outside of the line has any sacred or initiatic right to rule. And this is like the traditionalist heresy of Joseph the Maistre. And this is why when Dyer says, "Oh, we don't believe in perennialism," well, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the traditionalist heresy of Joseph the Maistre, which was basically orthodoxy. And that's why he got along so well with the Orthodox and wanted an Orthodox Catholic condominium. Um, of course, under the Pope, but underneath this kind of orthodox idea of epistemology, where man's incapable of reason to figure out moral questions. Um, Now, of course, therein comes the problem too, because, like Dugan's saying, the Orthodox want their emperor to lead, not a pope, not a patriarch. Fourthly, the eastern geographical location of Russian Orthodoxy logically puts it in close proximity to the lines of the Eastern Fathers, i.e., the saintly fathers of Greece, Anatolia, Syria, Lebanon, Cappadocia, etc. Fifthly, the tradition of hesychasm or light gnosis from the first anchorites and the Athos monastery was not the product of some kind of formalized organizational framework within Russian Orthodoxy. Hesychasm literally permeates the Orthodox tradition all the way to the point of its external aspects. Of course, the division between internal and external aspects remained, but there have never existed any structural differences between the hesychasts and the old believers on the one hand and the clergy and the believers on the other. This differs from the strict organization of initiatic orders in Catholicism, where this border is clearly marked. Sixthly and finally, the esoteric specificity of the orthodoxy has been preserved in the church ritual, and particularly in the presence of iconostasis, which separates the altar of the sacrament from the laity. Catholic ritual involves the openness of the altar, its accessibility to viewing by all the laity at any time during the service and outside of it. Thus, the sacrament of the altar is genuinely exoteric and descends to the outer level. In Orthodoxy, however, the gates of iconostasis, the royal gates, are open only for a short period of time during the key moments of the Orthodox liturgy, the exception being on certain holidays. This symbolizes the unique revelation of the apophatic unknowable principle on the other side of the cataphatic vision of the sacred world, which in a normal state is present only by symbols, the images of iconostasis, the deesis, near, etc., as if they replaced the altar. The unique feature of Orthodox ritual is connected to the historical absence of the development of scholastic and rational theological tradition in Russia, as theology itself in Orthodox Church relates to the initiatic and super-rational level, whereas the openness of the altar in Catholic Church relates the sacrament to the sphere of the rational and dogmatic. When the Catholic believer is in search of the initiation, he must to appeal to special non-church authorities, esoteric communities, brotherhoods, associations, etc. So this is Dugan's explanation for why Rosicrucianism and Martinism and all these things had to exist, is because there's no initiation of the Catholic Church in the Guananian sense. But the Orthodox can attain such a desire in the liturgy itself and enter in the most profound transcendent dimension without the aid of other sacred institutions. Thus, it should be grasped that the Orthodox Church, similarly in the Shiite trend in Islam, is not to subject to the strict division in exoteric and esoteric levels. This being true, at least on the level of the archetypal organization of the sacred system. However, this does not mean at all the Orthodoxy is esoteric or that all Orthodox are esotericists. Without a doubt, the division of the internal and external planes is maintained in Orthodoxy as it is everywhere else, depending on the personal qualities and spiritual cast of this or that human being. However, in our case, this division is not formalized, and the degree of initiatic quality depends exclusively on the internal nature of the believer and his efforts to realize his given spiritual possibilities. Of course, this degree of spiritual realization, strictly corresponding to the general structure of the initiatic sphere, is preserved in Orthodoxy, but its character is more flexibly and less structured than it is closed esoteric organizations. Subheading: The Quest of Virtual Initiation. Speaking of initiation, Guinan distinguished between virtual initiation and effective or realized initiation. From his point of view, the Christian religion, since becoming exoteric, cannot offer any sort of initiation. In Catholic ritual and in the Catholic sacrament, purely spiritual energies of the same nature as in initiatic rituals are also in action, but they are not oriented towards perfect interiorization and consequently affect only the outer side of the individual structure of believers. Salvation is guaranteed, but by the path higher to the super individual levels of existence is not opened as happens in purely esoteric mysteries. Now, this is what you need to understand, especially with Father Seraphim Rose and all of these people that were getting brought into the Alaskan Brotherhood, etc., is that this is what brings Seraphim Rose towards orthodoxy. I said this to Jay Dyer. Without reading Guinan, he could have become a Catholic. So this has to be understood as very extremely influential, especially since Seraphim Rose says that Rene Guinan was extremely influential to him on his spiritual path and finding the right religion. Is it just based on whether it's initiatory or not? Based on a dislike for dogmatic theology? Based on some sort of yearning for esotericism? Yes. This is the reason Father Seraphim Rose does this. This is the reason why he likes the tollhouse theory. This is the reason why Father Abbot Herman, formerly Father Abbot Herman, Podmonshensky, that's the reason why he was so lenient. Well, not lenient. I mean, he outright helped a cult, a Rosicrucian cult, invade the Greek Catholic Church or the Greek Orthodox Church. Going on. Salvation is guaranteed, but the path to higher super-individual levels of existence is not opened as happened in purely esoteric mysteries. However, an initiation received by means of esotericism might remain a forever virtual, untapped possibility. If there is a lack of knowledge of the secrets of the initiatic work, the great work, or if the dedicated prefers to use the wealth attained for goals opposite to the great goals of spiritual exaltation and the realization of purely heavenly spiritual states. Subheading Orthodox Initiation. Building on the particularities of the Orthodox tradition, basing ourselves on typological parallel with the Shiite tradition, an extremely important conclusion can be drawn. Orthodoxy is an operative instrument for transferring virtual initiation. Thus, Orthodox ritual itself, unlike Catholic ritual, preserves an initiatic character peculiar to original Christianity. A symbolic level, the Church of St. Andrew I, called the Orthodox Church, never fully separated itself from the esoteric Church of St. John, as happened in the case of the Church of St. Peter. In addition, the medieval legend of the kingdom of Prester John, located somewhere in the east, can be symbolically related not only to the main sacred center of primordial tradition, but also the analogy to Russia itself, where in fact John Ivan has always been the most widespread name. And this is kind of the origin of all of these, the Masonic obsession with St. John. This is particularly in uniqueness of Russian Orthodoxy has its doctrinal reflection in the Orthodox formula of faith, in which the rejection of the Catholic innovation of Filoloque, the assertion that the Holy See comes not only from the Father, the first entity of the Trinity, but also from the Son, the second entity, bears the character of the rejection of meditating entities between the sacred spiritual cosmos, as he says, the Holy Spirit, and the Genesis. In other words, it rejects exotericism as mediating force between the believer and initiation. The omnipresence of the Holy Spirit and its direct link to the Father, along with the apophatic hypostasis of the Trinity, means a direct totality of the spiritual light accessible to the Orthodox, which permeates being in every sense and opens the initiatic dispensation in Orthodox life. This Orthodox principle of divine dispensation, literally house building in Russian, which is central to the entire Eastern Church and practices precisely corresponding to the church dispensation, literally church building in Russia. Line of Western Christian initiation pronounced in the sphere of special non-church organizations of the initiatic type, later concentrated in Christian masonry and companionships. Such an initiatic phenomenon in Orthodoxy, and especially the absence of the Filoloque, explain the fact that unlike Catholic esotericism, in Orthodoxy there are no traces to be found of Hermeticism. Is that true? I don't think so. As a separate and independent discipline. There we go. As a sacred cosmology, Hermeticism actually focuses on the consecration of the sacred cosmos, the realm of the Holy Spirit, as the direct product of the Father in the forthright God-likeness of the cosmos, the theophany of the cosmos free from the passage of the censorship of the Logos. If in full-fledged theology the Logos Son is naturally shifted on the super-individual level, then that is transcendental in relation to the human mind, then in terms of degeneration of theological consciousness, this hypostasis of the Holy Trinity is in danger of being identified with the human mind, which is a price sly what happened in Catholic theology, beginning with the exclusion of the apophatic approach. This reaches its conclusion with rationalism and humanism of a semi-profane character. So, hatred of rationalism, hatred of the Western idea, and of course, rationalism must is a slippery slope fallacy. Rationalism must lead to nihilism because um, let's have our fallacy of composition version of rationalism and automatically presuppose that it defeats God because we're Orthodox. Um, Going on. Orthodox doctrine, by virtue of its natural and formal Hermeticism, did not undergo a similar transformation and has preserved its initiatic, super individual, and super rational nature. Some of this kind of gets boring. He goes into Russian cosmism, which is kind of a Teilhard de Chardin, Vladimir Vernadsky idea that he's criticizing. So I guess we'll read about that just because it's interesting. But finish this section. Of course, the chosen, the saints, the elders, and the monks, or any simply exceptional personalities can indeed reach the end of the path, but the majority are compelled to limit themselves to mere virtual initiation. Such a stipulation especially explains the phenomena of the widespread tradition of holy fools in Russia, those people who have acquired the opportunity of spiritual contemplation but are incapable of harmoniously combining it with the normal functioning of the individual rational level of their personality. On the other hand, holy foolishness as the phenomenon of Russian spirituality is in particular a telling aspect of Russian Orthodoxy, which once again confirms the Eastern Church initiatic nature. After all, without any special initiation, no holy fools would have existed. The difficulty associated with the complete realization of virtual initiation, however, is thus quite clear. Um, and I remembered another major work that I am looking through um, that's going to tie this to politics. Um, it's called The Globalization of Hesychasm. And it's a report regarding Alexander Dugin's implementation of hesychasm as his political major part of his fourth political theory. And as I always say, Jay Dyer is not, he doesn't have to be witting. There's this guy, Captain Slap Happy Cat, I don't know what his name is. Um, I could believe a lot of the things that he's saying is true, that the FSB might be paying money through some sort of conduit to fund Jay. I really don't know. I've looked into Jay's background before. His father's some sort of real estate guy. He comes from a family with money. So I don't know if that's necessary, but Dugan is, and I don't know how much I talked about this in previous video, but if you look into GRECE and the groups around Alan Benowitz and basically the worldwide um, Julius Evola faction of fascism, Alexander Dugin is very intent on promoting them and promoting their ideas, but he's also intent on promoting all sorts of ideas, people that disagree with him, people that agree with him. And Jay Dyer could absolutely fall into that kind of thing. The same thing with Soul of the East. Um, really, they fall in the same faction. There's different factions in Russia, and there's one faction that's very much for cooperation. And this is the faction that Putin's torn between for world cooperation and with America, and then there's the very extremely anti-American faction of, I guess, led by Dugin right now, and they are purely Russian Messianic faction. They are harkening back to these same people that created the initial socialist revolution in Russia, and uh, just like it was before, hand in hand with Orthodoxy. with Russian Orthodoxy, and hand with people that were re, uh, restorationists in the Baudrillian sense of Palamas and all of his followers, the initial Hesychasm movement. Anyway, finishing this article called Orthodox Initiation by Rene Alexander Dugin, subheading The Dark Mystery of Cosmism. When Rene Guénon spoke of counter-initiatic organizations of the West, he of course did not put quotation marks around the issue, as the very nature of this topic demands certain precautions. After all, if one summates all of what Guénon said on this question, including in form and innuendos and assumptions, the following picture unfolds. In the past centuries, counter-initiation has manifested itself all the more clearly in the degrading initiatic organization of the Hermetic type in the West. This can refer to the offshoots of Masonry as well as the neo-Rosicrucianist or neo-alchemical organizations. These groups, which inherited the secrets and rituals of virtual initiation, gave rise to a whole range of pseudo-initiatic occult and theosophical societies in the 19th century, which later formed the basis of what is acceptably been called neo-spiritualism. Guénon ranked magnetism, spiritism, the theosophism of Madame Blavatsky and Bizan, the occultism of Papus, the anthroposophy of Steiner, and all the extensions and variations of such neo-mysticists and pseudo-esoteric trends as neo-spiritualisms. Today, the majority of such neo-spiritualist organizations are united under the sign of the syncretic New Age movement. Neo-spiritualism itself is not directly counter-initiatic, but it is an instrument aimed at the destruction of the remnants of the tradition in the West under the guise of a return to spirituality, which in turn leads the profane into the abyss of dissolution into psychic chaos. In turn, counter-initiation belongs to a much deeper level of reality, being associated with what has been called the devil's mission. Rene Guénon considers the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor to be one of the most dangerous counter-initiatic organizations. The line is drawn from this to the more massive neo-spiritualist tendencies, including even those sometimes opposed to its teachings, such as Theosophism, occultism, perverted Neo-Hinduism, and others. It is extremely telling that the doctrines of Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor was called the cosmic philosophy, the cosmic doctrine, or sometimes cosmism. The essence of cosmism of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor consists of contact with the cosmos and the cosmic consciousness, which means the attainment of the light nature of the cosmos. The light theme is the embodiment in the very name of the order, Luxor, the Egyptian city, whose name is similar in the name Latin word lux, or light, and the name Lucifer of light bringer. The cosmic doctrine concentrates all attention on the psychic and subtle plane, practically identifying the spiritual and superpsychic with that of the soul or mental element. This is not a special form of philosophically abstract pantheism, but a magical, concrete, operative, and aggressive one. Besides actually ignoring the transcendental aspects of the spirit, the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor Cosmism also threatened transferring many initiatic, sacred, and spiritual symbols and rituals to the mental and material level, which entails a parodying of true initiation and grotesque and dangerous imitation. The members of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, possessing indisputable paranormal capabilities, were not only the first to formulate the foundations of the neo-spiritualist theories, but also through provoking mysterious phenomena, achieved their speedy introduction to the most diverse cultural and scholarly environments. Historically, the roots of the secret society date back to the several German Masonic lodges of the 18th century, in which the members of the highest degree practice operative magic. Roots can be traced back to the unconventional masonry of the Egyptian Rite of Memphis, Mizraim, and sexual magic groups of Randolph, which displayed considerable satanic characteristics. In fact, the cosmism of counter-initiatic Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor was later inherited by openly satanic centers such as the Order of Templars of Orient, OTO, of Kellner and Aleister Crowley, which called itself the Beast of 666. Ugh. If we turn Russia in the second half of the 19th century, we discover a quite striking phenomenon, which was called Russian cosmism. Most famous representatives was Nikolai Fedorov, the author of the famous work The Philosophy of the Common Cause. In Fedorov's biography, there is no mention of any contact with counter-initiatic organizations, but his works remain a compendium of counter-initiatic doctrines that almost exactly match those of Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor. Fedorov even maintained the theory of artificially resurrecting the dead, which tradition considers to be an outspoken sign of the kingdom of the Antichrist. In addition, Fedorov's ideas, to a certain extent, formed the paradigm for the transfer of spiritual, symbolic, and religious doctrines to the psychic materialist level. Among these, we find theories of the management of atmospheric phenomena, the conversion of churches into museums, like I think they're doing with Notre Dame. And finally, the project for establishing a universal and indispensable human brotherhood to include all the resurrected love of the ancestors and become the crown of history. Federer's moral utopianism and pantheist messianism inspired a number of Russian philosophers, scholars, writers, and theoreticians, and what's more, his cosmism was extremely popular in Bolshevik circles, who identified the brotherhood of the risen and resurrected with communism. In some sense, the ideas of Fedorov reflected the exalted revolutionary messianism of the era. So you have Bolsheviks from the see Alexander Dugin. What he's doing is trying to divide and dismiss the fact that a lot of the Bolshevik initiators and Russian symbolists and cultural avant-garde of the day were these hesychast restorationists. Um, he's trying to say that cosmism was the most critical aspect of Bolshevism. We see that these are both movements that are influential in Bolshevism, and that these movements create multiple factions within Bolshevism. Going on. However, Fedorovist cosmism, in fact, possesses a purely Orthodox Christian form, which was not the only, although perhaps the most striking manifestation of counter-initiatic cosmism in Russia. In a broader sense, Russian cosmism can be clearly formulated tendency of Orthodox virtual initiation, which, if we recall its universal nature, ensured by the mere fact of confessional belonging, was realized not by the means of positive ascent from the mental world to the purely spiritual, heavenly, super-individual one, but by means of fusing with the intermediately psychic world that is the thin cosmos. In this cosmos, specifically natural Russian counter-initiation negatively attracted the issue of the Philoloque, just as how, if the path from the spiritual universe, from the cosmos of the Holy Spirit to the apophatic principle of the Father itself, is not completed, then no mere rational or formalized structures can hold back individuals from fusing with the subtle plane and immersing into the chaos and excitement of what tradition calls the lower waters. Russian cosmism is thus the ultimate form of degradation of the Orthodox holy fooldom, a demonic form of this foolishness, in which the holy fools of Christ become the holy fools of the Antichrist. So remember that holy fooldom is the state where the initiate in his personal life cannot handle the initiation. And so he constantly falls, he constantly is encouraged to sin. But in cosmism, it's kind of the other way around. Um, there is no more initiatic aspect to it. And instead, he's going towards this kind of scientific end goal. Um, still continuing to fail, etc., but there's no real initiation. It is a character of cosmism which sharply distinguishes practically all of the Russian philosophy, science, and culture from European profanity, just as how cosmicist consciousness is drawn specifically to the non-rational, paradoxical, and powerful mode of subtle energy which breaks through the structure of logical constructions. If in Russia in the 20th century the most heinous persecutions of the church was indeed carried out under the communist regime, then we should see in the natural counter-initiation of the Orthodox nation deprived of its vertical holy perspective for a lack of rational logos-related boundaries, lapsed into the extreme forms of demonic, aggressive, and anarchist cosmicist foolishness, and above all the foolishness of the Antichrist. Conclusion. So some of this doesn't even make sense to me. So let's see if the conclusion can actually make any sense of these writings here. Features of the Russian Church and its specificity, which we have broken down, might help understand the bizarre and strange world of the Russian conscience, which is similar neither to Western nor Eastern forms. In his book, East and West, Guinan identifies the Russians as the people which imitates the archetypes inherent to the true Eastern people. In another place, he noted how occultist and spiritualist practices are widely spread in Russia, something which he saw as evidence of the Russian special propensity for psychism. Finally, he puts forth the quite mysterious statement with Russian communism is most likely something other than what it is commonly considered. Despite their criticality, these assessments indeed fairly describe the Orthodox people whose true spiritual elite, albeit too small and weak, pushed virtual initiation to the point of universality. While at the lowest levels, it is perhaps the masses imitated the possession of the true spiritual mystery of the East. Perhaps the Russian idea of sobernost and universality, such as that of the Slavophiles, which is the ones we were talking about, coming out of Russian Martinism. Later, the communist and socialist idea of universal equality were in fact the expression of a vague conscience of the general degradation of the nation, its universal brotherhood. Indeed, members of esoteric organizations call each other brothers, as do lodges, orders, and monastic communities. It also cannot be excluded that the Bolshevik Revolution was an explosion of part of this justified conviction of the universal dedication, seeking to cancel the exoteric hierarchy, the master system, as something unnecessary and viciously imposed by the alien West. The Grand Inquisitor of Dostoevsky and a social philoloque, which leaving a barrier between the people and the light cosmos of the Holy Spirit. But properly speaking, these same tendencies, only a closed conspiratorial level, also enliven the majority of the counter-initiate organizations, which were not only anti-Catholic but also foreign to the socialist and communist pathos. For example, Theodore Roos, who initiated Aleister Crowley, the Beast of 666, into esotericism, was a known anarchist and socialist. However, no other country or region of the earth has such counter-initiatic, thoroughly cosmicist, and mystical communist trends manifested themselves to such an extent as in Russia, which for 70 years became the epitome of the Red Woman of the Apocalypse, the Whore of Babylon. But even long before this period, in dark political mysticism and plotting of the time of troubles, coupled with the succession of impostors and the grandiose stagings of the apocalypse by the sinister Emperor Peter I, and the grotesque parody of the Russian Enlightenment of the time of Catherine, and finally in the disturbing and psychedelic literature of Gogol, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, and Sologub, and philosophy of Komyakov, Solovyov, Rozanov, etc., of Russia and the sprouts of the red cosmos, sowed by the virtual initiation of Russian Orthodoxy, matured and produced flowers that pointed not upwards towards the sun of Russian holiness, the spiritual son of Sergei Radonezhsky, Niels Sorsky, and Seraphim Rose-inspired, but downwards. The current state of Russia cannot be defined in purely economic or political terms. The seeds of virtual initiation, it should not be forgotten that even under the communist dictatorship, the majority of Russian baptize their children, are too significant and active to expect any kind of transformation of Russia into a purely secular capitalist or profane state of the Western model. The roots of the Russian phenomenon are too deep and too tragic to count on such an outcome. The Russian soul, and more precisely the complexity of the Russians virtually initiated who form the mystical body of the inner church, cannot abandon their initiatic and crucial function. Either there will be a catastrophe even more frightening and deep than under communism, or contrary to all external circumstances, a spiritual elite will appear which will halt the rapid decline into the abyss, instantly casting the nation of red beast into the spiritual heavens of the Holy Trinity, much like Christ himself, freeing old Adam from the snares of hell. If the possibility of salvation still exists for counter-initiatic civilizations, then does initiatic Orthodox Russia not remain the best place for ascension? So, um, that's about all I have for now. Oh wow, Captain Slappy is here, and he's been. I, these are all saved, I think, these chats. So I'll read the chats later on. Thanks for watching, Captain Slappy and Cerilli C. Thanks for the likes. Looks like I only had 2 likes. Hopefully, John Bresson gets to see this. Um, okay, some funny stuff there. Anyway, guys, have a good night. Happy New Year's and Merry Christmas. I didn't get to see you since then, and we'll be back with some more information. I think there's going to be an addendum that's just some of the articles where I only had screenshots and I had to read like an extremely abbreviated section. But all right, have a good night. God bless you. This is I Read All the Magazines. Please like and subscribe if you used any of this information. And like I said too, maybe I'll make a recap video so we can compress this whole thing into a little bit of like a uh, expose movie video that you can send around to different people so that we can let people know about this giant threat, um, and this giant trend that's really derivative of something else. I'd say biggest thing you can do is try to if you get on Twitter or Facebook or something like that. Um, First thing you got to do is go give Wrath of Non, Gnon, some uh, some shade. Throw some shade his way, and yeah. All right. Well, have a good night. I just need to get off.